Maximilien Robespierre. That name, it's pretty much synonymous with the French Revolution, right? But it's also tied to its absolute most brutal chapter. His story is just this huge, tragic contradiction, and it really forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
And this is the one historians have been wrestling with for centuries. How does a guy who champions liberty become the architect of terror? How did a man who fought so hard for equality and justice turn into the very kind of tyrant he wanted to overthrow?
So that's the journey we're going to unpack today. We start with this image, the face of the revolution, a passionate idealist. And we end here, with that exact same man facing the guillotine, the very fate he handed out to thousands. His story really is the story of the revolution itself, this dramatic, bloody roller coaster from idealism straight into terror.
Okay, so to really understand the tyrant, you have to first get to know the idealist. Because before all the terror, Robespierre was famous for his unwavering principles. I mean, it even earned him a pretty powerful nickname.
They called him the Incorruptible. As a young lawyer and politician, he was all about those Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He truly, genuinely believed that a government's only real power comes from the people it governs. And this wasn't just him talking a big game. His early career was all about fighting for some seriously radical causes.
And to get just how radical this was, think about the year, 1789. Anti-Semitism was just everywhere in Europe. And yet, here's Robespierre arguing with everything he's got that France needed to face up to its national crimes and give Jewish people their full, undeniable human rights. He was way, way ahead of his time.
But his radicalism didn't stop there. Not even close. When the new constitution looked like it might actually protect slavery in France's rich colonies, Robespierre's reaction was just stunning. He basically said that liberty was more important than all that colonial money, proclaiming he'd rather the colonies just disappear than sacrifice the principles of the revolution. This was a man willing to give up literally anything for his ideals.
So, what happened? What was the turning point? Well, the moment where that fierce idealism started to curdle into something much, much darker was the trial and execution of King Louis XVI.
So after the monarchy was totally abolished, the king was put on trial, but not as a king, just as citizen Louis Capet. The entire nation was watching. I mean, what do you do with a deposed king? For Robespierre, this wasn't just some legal question, it was an existential one for the whole revolution.
He framed the debate with this kind of chilling logic. He argued that if you have a trial, that means there's a chance the person is innocent. And, he said, if the king can be found innocent, well then the revolution itself has to be guilty. So for the new republic to live, there couldn't be any doubt. The king wasn't a person on trial, he was a symbol, a threat that had to be eliminated.
And that single, powerful sentence, it sealed the king's fate. But you know the most shocking part? Robespierre had actually argued for abolishing the death penalty before. So here he is, willing to sacrifice his own stated principles, his own abhorrence of capital punishment, all for what he saw as the nation's survival. It was a fatal compromise.
With the king gone, Robespierre's power just exploded. He became the leading voice on this new committee that was created to protect the young republic from all its enemies, inside and out. And this was the infamous Committee of Public Safety.
And that period became known as the Reign of Terror. The committee's official job was to preserve public liberty. But in practice, what it really meant was hunting down anyone they decided was an enemy. Pretty soon, Robespierre started seeing enemies everywhere, even executing former friends and allies like Georges Danton just for questioning the level of violence. Disagreement was now treason.
So how in the world could he justify this? Well, this table, which is based on his own words, shows his terrifying logic. A normal, constitutional government protects its citizens from the state. But a revolutionary government, he argued, has to protect the state from its enemies. And what do those enemies deserve? Well, according to him, the government owes them nothing but death. He basically built this intellectual framework where terror wasn't just an option, it was a civic duty.
And he was frighteningly good at selling it. A quantitative analysis of the debates from that time actually reveals his method. Robespierre and his allies were what they call high-novelty innovators, always pushing the conversation into new, more radical places. The conservatives, on the other hand, just acted like inertial dampeners, always trying to slow things down. So Robespierre wasn't just winning arguments, he was literally changing the language of politics itself, making his radical vision feel like it was the only way forward.
But a fire that burns that hot can't last forever. The terror was doomed to burn itself out. Ultimately, the revolution turned on its own chief architect, and after the bloodshed finally stopped, what was left? What came out of this violent, paradoxical movement in the long run?
As the bodies kept piling up, that fear turned back on Robespierre himself. His own colleagues, terrified they'd be next on his list, had him arrested. And on July 28, 1794, Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, was executed by the guillotine, bringing his own reign of terror to an end.
But the story doesn't end with his death. Far from it. Beyond all the terror, the revolution actually laid the foundations of modern France. The whole idea of a republic, the strict separation of church and state, or laïcité, the Napoleonic Code, which is still the basis of French law, and of course, that enduring motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood. But, and this is a huge but, we have to remember the limits of this new equality. Activists like Olympe de Gouges called out the hypocrisy of a revolution for the rights of man that completely ignored half the population, and for daring to demand rights for women, she was executed in 1793. In fact, French women wouldn't even get the right to vote until 1944, a pretty stark reminder that the fight for real equality had only just begun.
Which brings us right back to the man at the center of it all. So what's his final legacy? Was he a monster, corrupted by power? A tragic idealist who just believed that a perfect republic could be forged in blood? Or maybe a martyr to a vision of purity so absolute, so incorruptible, that it could only ever end in self-destruction? The answer? Well, it's still one of history's most unsettling questions.